All right, this is development chapter 3, the notes for this, and we're going to be talking about how humans develop from before they're born all the way through death. So go ahead and take the title card down now. And we'll start with prenatal development. So this is after conception, when you have a fetus that is growing and developing organs and systems and all of this. What can harm it? One of the diseases that can harm early in pregnancies is German measles, also called rubella. Rubella is probably used more often today. There is a vaccine that exists that, if the mother's been vaccinated, then, and that can be done. Usually it's kind of required now, but, that can be done up to 3 months before the pregnancy. And, usually rubella deafness is the most common consequence of getting that. X-rays, other radiation and toxic chemicals. That's why we use ultrasounds to look at fetuses instead of X-rays, because that kind of radiation can cause abnormalities. And so even, eating contaminated fish and things like that can cause problems. There's been some studies in terms of its relation to attention problems, lower IQ scores, STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, from genital herpes, can affect the fetus if there's an outbreak at the time. HIV, AIDS, syphilis, other things can definitely have an effect on physical disorders, blindness, things like that. Cigarette smoking is a big one. Can increase the likelihood of miscarriages or premature births, of underweight babies, and these negative effects can cause, sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. So, like, even after the birth, if you smoked during the birth, it could cause a lot of problems. And these are all coulds. This isn't 100%, but the studies have been done show these rates have increased. Consumption of alcohol. That's why when you're pregnant, you can't drink alcohol, because it can literally kill the neurons that are developing the fetus's brain, and so certain functions, won't work. And then if you have more than 2 drinks a day, then fetal alcohol syndrome is very, very possible. Low birth rate, smaller brain, and it can be really bad. And then doing drugs other than alcohol can be extremely harmful. Morphine, cocaine, heroin, even some like diet pills and antibiotics. Some things that are legal can cause a lot of problems. So you really have to be careful with that. Pregnant women can have a tough, can't drink, can't smoke cigarettes, and be very careful what's put in their bodies. Baby's born, and let's talk about infancy a bit. We'll get a bit more into this, as time goes on. Infants have motor reflexes automatically for survival. So kind of an interesting psychological piece that you're born with a lot of these instincts. So, for example, right, a newborn knows how to suck and knows how to grasp things, because that's what helps them eat, right? When we talk about, breastfeeding or bottles, right? Babies know they can grab that food and they can suck to get that food and eat it. You have to know that, or we would be extinct. So that's something that psychologically comes with birth. That's an evolutionary trait. Emotional attachments begin with contact comfort. If you remember in the ethics studies, we talked about the study of those monkeys, and they preferred kind of the fake cloth mom. You can see that in your vocab reading. You can see some of the pictures from that, because that close contact comfort is really important. And once babies are kind of emotionally attached to the mother or whatever caregiver, between 6 and 8 months old or so, babies are going to start to be wary of strangers. They're not going to want their parent to leave, their primary caregiver to leave. It's separation anxiety, and this can occur through ages 2 and 3, and it can, lead to some issues later. Both, if that separation anxiety exists, And then you have some insecure attachments that come later, right? It can occur later in life if there is abandonment in the first 2 years. There can be some heavy insecurities about um, kids, and that basically it just they feel like they're going to get neglected. They feel like they're just going to get left, right? So if there's abusive parenting, if there's neglectful parenting, if parents abandon them, can lead to issues. But we also have some children. Their genetics are prone to attachment issues. There's been some studies on that. So that's stressful, changing circumstances. All these things can lead to insecure attachments. Um, so they become clingy. They are fearful of being left alone. So these things can occur in infants. Let's talk about cognitive development. So a little bit. Some of the things that we do as humans in terms of parenting actually have, we may do automatically, but has some root in brain development, cognitive development. Parentese, as it's called, right? Baby talk. When talking to a baby, your voice gets higher, you extend your vowels. And this is used to introduce babies to native language, and it's actually a strategy to teach kids language. So they did some studies, basically, having moms talk to their kids, having moms talk to their dogs. I don't know about you, but I talk to my dog. It's very baby talkish, right? I speak in a higher voice tone, and that can have a positive thing. But what they found was they don't extend the vowels. There actually is a piece that parents know subconsciously of teaching kids language, and so you don't have to teach the dog language. Dog isn't going to learn it. So this happens, and now children will learn. They're going to learn sounds. They're going to learn words pretty early on, and they're going to start to associate actions with words, right? That's what happens early on. So there could be things like and that become very telegraphic in nature. So you could have that pointing to your mouth, right? It means that you're hungry. That's something that kids can develop for sure. So when they get familiarity with what they kind of what they need, then we can see that start to develop of kind of actions, sniffing, to indicate flowers, right? Or um, raising their arms for big, making an action. That's development of language. They understand the language. They maybe can't quite say it yet, but they can show that. And developing language is dependent on biology and on social experience. You still need to have that interaction between adults, those that are speaking that language, and the kids, right? If the child doesn't hear language, they're not going to learn language, but there is a biological element to learning it. So, kids will cut out kind of those words they don't need, right? They don't need they don't need is. They'll say "mama here" and "my toy." They don't need anything additionally. So, more milk, right? They don't have to say, "Hey, I want more milk, please." More milk, it gets it across, and then that's what starts happening. That's usually before 2 years old, until we start to see that language really grow. So there have been some language studies done on language acquisition, and it doesn't matter if it's English, it doesn't matter if it's a different language. And they've actually found that children in different cultures go through similar stages of linguistic development. So, they'll form their first negatives by saying no or not at the beginning or end of a sentence, right? No, get dirty, no, and they'll start to use double negatives pretty early on. He don't want no milk, things like that, right? No matter what the language is, we see those things happen. So very similar structure. Children combine words in ways that adults never would, right? So like I talked about, they reduce kind of the sentences. Instead of "let's go to the store," "go store." They really start to, even making errors in language, saying like "daddy take me." those kind of things. It's different, but they'll always do that no matter the language as well. And I thought number 3 is kind of really interesting. Even if adults don't consistently correct their children, if they don't say, hey, that's not how you say that, here's how you say that, those kids will learn to speak correctly anyway. So they'll learn to say the right words just in interaction. And so, right, oftentimes parents will reward their children for saying the wrong thing. If a 2-year-old says, want milk, most parents aren't going to say, well, you got to say that grammatically correct, right? So you're getting the milk. That's rewarding them for that sentence. They'll still speak correctly. They'll still come out with the right language. So really interesting. Children not exposed to adult language will make their own. So what if they never experience language? So it's kind of crazy. They've done studies in America, in Taiwan, in Spain, in Turkey, in Nicaragua, and found that kids not exposed to language will come out with their own language. Most of these studies were done on deaf children, right? 'Cause the deaf children aren't going to hear language. And so before they even learn, say, a sign language or any kind of universal language, they will develop their own. And they develop the language in America, the language in Taiwan, the language in Spain, the language in Turkey, all very, very similar. So doesn't matter what the culture is. And number 5, infants above 7 months can derive linguistic rules within the sounds that they make. So basically, they create kind of patterns that we create with our language. So even if they're not making sentences, they'll kind of make sentences out of their sounds. So they might do an ABA pattern, ga ti ga, or lina li, until they get bored. Then when they prefer a new sentence, they might do an ABB pattern, woo fi fi, woo fi woo. They'll kind of go back to the ABA. So they actually fit within these structures of our language just by making noises, when they can't talk yet. So very interesting with that. We'll get into Piaget's studies later in this chapter. But this is kind of the earliest theories of cognitive stages was developed by Jean Piaget, and it's something that as an education major in grad school I studied. But we've actually learned that a lot of what he did is not wholly correct anymore. He kind of put things a little bit too rigidly. I'll get into that, but. You read these, this makes sense, right? He has a sensory motor stage from birth to 2 years birth to 2 years old. Excuse me. So this is learning through concrete action, right? Sucking, grasping, those kind of things, right? These kids are learning through action what they can do. Object permanence is one of your vocabulary words. So that's the understanding that something continues to exist. If you can't see it the first few months, that's not going to happen, right? If mom goes in the other room, you think she's gone forever. That's what happens, right? If so, we can see that about 6 months they start to get the idea. Hey, they drop their toy out of the playpen to look for it. It still exists, but that's something that can change. The pre-operational stage is ages 2 to 7, using symbols, language. They start to develop that. They start to communicate. Like I said, use different symbols, but they can't really view from another's perspective or conserve things. So, they're very egocentric. They're seeing things from their own point of view. We'll get into later in the next slide. Is that really true? But that's just Piaget's theory. One thing that seems to make sense is conservation. Kids 2 to 7 don't think they can conserve. If I gave them, here's $5, you can spend it at the candy store, and whatever you don't use, you can save. They're not going to save anything, right? They don't know how to conserve things. They're going to use it up now. Going to use all that stuff out now. So there's been some different studies with that, that they're unable to understand like an amount of liquid or a number of pennies remains the same even if you pour the liquid in one glass to another, or if you stack up the pennies, I think it changes. So, in some studies with that. Concrete operations, 7 through 12, is empathy, developing empathy, but they can still only do it in concrete examples, right? So asking them things like talking about patriotism or future education. I mean, that makes sense to them. As abstract ideas can't be processed yet, but they start to form that idea that, hey, things affect other people, and sometimes you can do things for the betterment of others. And then formal operations, 12 to adulthood, as abstract reasoning conclusions start to occur. Now, I'll move on to the current cognitive views here. And what we've seen is maybe Piaget's theory there in the last slide, not wholly correct. That cognitive development is continuous. It doesn't just fall in these stages. You might, that object permanence may not happen right at 6 months old. It may develop over time, little by little. Conservation might change little by little. One kid might get it earlier than another. We've also seen the empathy piece pretty much is wrong on Piaget's theory that preschoolers can have empathy. That honestly, as I'll get into, it's actually a really good way to parent by empathy. That's kind of the difference here is that preschoolers can understand that their actions affect other people if you focus it to them that way. Number 3, children understand a lot more than Piaget gives them credit for, and adults understand maybe far less than Piaget gives them credit for. That they kind of reveal that that babies can be born with some spatial relation of objects. That 4 months of age, babies will look longer at a ball if it seems to roll through a solid barrier, or leap between two platforms, or hang in midair. If they see that it's doing something unusual, they'll understand that. They're not just going to accept it. That's pretty crazy. That's very different from Piaget's theory. And so the kids' reasoning can grow. It can be spurred on by their growth, by information processing. So as they grow, they can expand more. And then finally, number 5, cognitive development depends on the child's education and culture. That culture is going to preference different language, tools, rituals. Education is a big thing. You can introduce them to numbers and to these ideas, and they can conceive it. So it's not wholly out of view. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of learning how to act, children start to learn moral judgment around age 10. So they start to see that there are things that are good and things that are bad, understanding right from wrong. But this also comes with knowing knowing cheating and lying and cruelty, knowing that is wrong, but we could still do it, right? So that's an issue. And parenting has been studied a ton, and so parents asserting punishment and authority over kids can actually lead to higher aggressiveness in children. So reduced empathy and more. So think about spanking, and this is maybe semi-controversial, but a lot of people say my parents spanked me, I was fine, taught me respect, whatever. Scientifically, not good. That kind of punishment actually generally will lead to those physical punishments having the child be more aggressive, have reduced empathy. That they think that they can hit others, they can insult others. So threatening, insulting kids is not a way to get them to do what you want. What the science has said is the better psychological appeal is to appeal to the child's empathy and their affection for others. That can be really good, right? Like, hey, you made Doug cry. It's not nice to bite people, right? Like that's going to work better than spanking the kid for biting Doug. So then they can see how their actions affect. Um, saying, hey, you shouldn't poke anyone in the eye, could really hurt them. That's going to work better than, calling them a name. So now, you don't want to go too far with that. You don't want to go too far with that and be permissive. Let the kid do whatever they want. You can still be tough, but phrase it in the right way. So gender development, we definitely in America we have this kind of focus on the gender of a child and all this, but a child's gender identity, it can be different from their identified sex, right? And so gender typing is something that is often done, socializing children into gender roles, and that can have long-term harm on children if it's heavily pushed as they develop. If a 1-year-old boy wants to wear a dress, it's not going to harm him to wear that dress. And like I said, what we can see is that those kind of the punishment that can have major effects and when pushing at gender typing, whereas gender identity can be different from a child's identified sex and can be recognized very early in a child's life. There's been a lot of scientific studies done that this is true. And we've seen the trans community grow, and rightfully so, as the science has really backed up gender identity and that the sex of a child doesn't necessarily fit to their gender. That gender itself is more on a spectrum than a light switch. That you're either 100% male or 100% female. It can be more on a spectrum, and different identities occur within that spectrum. So, we're not going to get super deep into it in this kind of course, but it is something to keep in mind. Biological cognitive learning, they all can influence gender development and gender roles. Culture, is definitely a big aspect to that. So you can see what some of those influences are. Adolescence, puberty. This is what results in biological adulthood, but not necessarily societal adulthood, right? So, back in earlier times when a male or female would go through puberty, they'd be considered an adult. We don't do that anymore because we realize kids develop much more past that, not just biologically. That they can conceive children means they're an adult now. So, and puberty can occur early or late. That is perfectly normal and can have an effect on physical and social development, right? So, and I'm sure some of you have went through this before. Sometimes when a girl goes through puberty early, what they found is that socially she's more accepted. She's kind of into this adulthood range, but sometimes those girls that go through puberty later will actually come out better socially later in life. So, it can have different influences on kind of how it works. And the brain also develops at puberty. We see spikes in conflict with parents and mood swings, depression. All those things go up through puberty and kind of in your early teenage years. And so it could be something you're experiencing now. It could be something that, a year or 2 years ago, you felt like, it was a big conflict with my parents, and now things are kind of better. It might take another year or two before that happens, depending. So that's okay. And then here's kind of our life stages, the stages of life, different ages. So we have kind of trust versus mistrust, that this is a challenge that occurs during the baby's first year. Baby depends on others for food, comfort. If those needs aren't met, then the child's not going to develop trust. We'll develop autonomy, independence versus shame and doubt. This is more toddler age. When the child's learning to be independent, they have to do so without, feeling too ashamed. They got to try to assert their independence, but if they do things wrong, you don't want to shame them for that. Initiative versus guilt, kind of similar to that. Preschoolers, when they're trying to acquire more physical or mental skills, they're going to say things wrong, and that's okay. You don't want to guilt them for that. Competence versus inferiority, right? School-age children trying to learn how to make things, use tools. They fail at the mastery sometimes. That can come out that, hey, they're inferior, and they feel that way. You want to try to prop them up a little bit. Identity versus role confusion, right? In adolescence is kind of what your identity is, like who you are, who am I as a person, where do I fit in the social structure? That's normal. Intimacy versus isolation is the challenge of young adulthood, right? Trying to decide who you are and you share yourself with others. Are you intimate? Are you isolated? Generativity versus stagnation is more like middle school age. That's or even high school, even college. Sometimes it takes becoming a parent to have generativity and being generous and giving, right? Sometimes it takes something, that creativity, to kind of spark. Then ego integrity versus despair, more old age. If you don't have any more goals, you just despair or you find other things. Then adulthood, our social clocks based on culture are fully formed in adulthood, but most young adults feel they're not ready for adulthood yet. That's okay. 35 to 65 years old, generally the prime of people's lives, but women and men's biological clocks, they can stop working in the 40s and 50s, menopause for women. That's okay. And the elderly will lose some cognitive ability, but most issues with the elderly generally come from not eating enough, medication, etc. So we'll talk more about that later. Thank you so much, and have a good one.